Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Vera de Chalambert. Vera is a mindfulness facilitator, spiritual storyteller, and Harvard-educated scholar of comparative religion, working at the feet of the Great Mother. Her invitation is one of embodied presence. We are already what we seek. Her healing practice is heart-centered and based on the non-dual approach. Vera has spent many years studying the world's great wisdom and healing traditions and brings forth a unique blend of healing presence, spiritual insight, and philosophical range. She is a graduate of the Barbara Brennan School of Healing and has studied non-dual healing with Jason Schulman at the Institute for Non-Dual Healing and Awakening. Vera works with clients in person and internationally via Skype, writes and teaches classes on mindfulness in the modern world and the divine feminine. She gives talks and presentations around the world and was a speaker at SAND Science and Non-Duality Conference in the US and Europe and Sister Giant in Washington, D.C. Vera holds a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School. Her healing work is informed by rich insights from both Eastern and Western philosophies. Vera's path is deeply influenced by the Kabbalistic and Buddhist lineages, something we'll talk about today. Her spiritual practice includes meditation, dance, and motherhood, and her greatest spiritual training and commitment are to the school of daily life, where the divine reveals itself among the perils and joys of the mundane, and the deepest process of healing and awakening unfolds in the heart of human relationship, creativity, and community.
Well, that sounds like a cool person. I don't know who that is.
She's you, man. She's you. She's you, Vera. It is a beautiful bio. So to start, I know you wanted to start with an invocation, so I wanted you to maybe share that.
Well, I thought maybe we start with a mantra to the mother.
Yeah, let's do it.
So Chamunda is one of the forms of Kali. She's a particularly fierce form of the dark feminine. And this is her mantra. Maybe we do it 3 times together.
Okay.
It's Om, Aim, Hrim, Shrim, Klim, Chamundaye, Viche, Namaha.
Okay. I'm gonna struggle with that a little bit. Let's do it again.
All right. Well, it's okay. I'll have it just follow me and say it. Yeah. Om, Aim, Hrim, Shrim, Klim, Chamundaye, Viche, Namaha. Om, Aim, Hrim, Shrim, Klim, Chamundaye, Viche, Namaha. Om, Aim, Hrim, Shrim, Klim, Chamundaye, Viche, Namaha.
Beautiful. So Vera, I want to talk a lot about the mother today, especially something that I find really fascinating about your recent work and writing has been on the dark feminine and I think and the divine darkness and the dark night of the soul and just this theme of darkness in general that I think you express so beautifully, especially in a world where it's like it's constant light, love and light. Yeah. It's always and there does seem to be kind of a privileging of one side of things, and I feel like your work is really highlighting the necessity of really moving through these, the darker aspects of self, and one of the ways in which you highlight that is through kind of this deity approach where you unpack the kind of symbology and iconography and the philosophy of the various feminine deities, some of which are of this kind of darker element, like Kali, for example. You wrote a beautiful article on Kali. But before we get into all of that, I would love to just hear a little bit about your story and what led you to such a devotional commitment to the Great Mother.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I might be completely incoherent, so if I am, you can just read something I wrote, which somehow turned out to be coherent. But so, really, what happened was that the mother came in and burned up my life, and I, for quite a period of time, went through a very, very deep, dark, long night, dark night of the soul, and I cannot say that I'm on the other side of it, even. I guess if I had to tell a story, I would say that I had a beautifully put together life in some ways. You know, I lived in Paris. I had a beautiful healing practice in the center in Paris. A beautiful, like perfect marriage, perfect family, perfect things unfolding. You know, and underneath there was this suspicion that things are not as they seem. You know, when you are containing, but you're not, you can't even tell that you're containing. It's like this subtle holding everything together, this subtle resisting. And I found myself one evening going to an Amma darshan. Not a darshan, actually, one of those sort of all-night Devi Baba. I don't know if you...
Like Amma the Hugging Saint. Oh,
like Amma.
Yeah, we do that in New York.
Like Amma the Hugging Saint. And I did it once before. It was lovely. It's very bliss-bathed usually, right? It's like this expansive, ecstatic, all-night thing, or at least the one that I went to, all-night thing. And so I walked into that kind of compound where it was unfolding, and I found myself on my knees, on the ground, wailing into the ground, "Mother, burn me up, Mother, burn me up, Mother, burn me up." And as it was like this thing that just was happening. And as it was happening, there was almost this other part of me of like, what is going on? Like, I don't mean it. You know, like there was this fear, like I didn't understand where it was coming from, but it was like from the core of my being, you know, there was this place in which I think my devotional heart was opening, you know. I didn't want to contain. I didn't want anything. I wanted the real, you know. And the way it came out is like, take me, like burn me up, at the same time as this other part of me like, I don't mean it, take it back, you know, like take it back. But this kind of like, just from the beginning, it started doing something, you know. And I mean, I had this beautiful night. I mean, you know how those nights are. It's really dancing and singing, and you get in line, and around it, there's all these beautiful objects and crystals and malas and saris, and that whole night, I was like circling a table with beautiful jewelry on it, and there was a particular object there that I like needed. I don't know if you ever had that experience where you see something and you need it. It was like I needed it. And I kept coming back to it and being like, oh, I should get it. Oh, I don't want to buy things. I don't want to consume. So I finally said, listen, I really need these earrings, but I only see one. You know, can I have them? And she said, oh, there is only one. This earring came from the Kali statue at Amma's ashram. You know, I was already a scholar of religion. I was familiar with Kali from far distance, and my Judeo-Christian mind was a little bit like, thanks, but no thanks. And I remember getting the chill through my body and just walking away, like as far away as I could from the table and feeling very uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Quickly forgotten, the blissful night continued to expand. In the end, in the morning, like through the night, she blesses babies and blesses people getting married. Then she throws, Amma, throws rose petals on you in blessing. Beautiful, expanded, ecstatic. Love and light. Yeah. And the morning ended, got into my car with a friend, into her car with a friend, and 10, 15 minutes out of the compound on a highway in the woods, a red car, full speed, a red car comes out of its lane and crashes into my car head to head, full speed. Collision. And I mean, it's like the classic, you know, time stops. Nothing left of the vehicles. You know, I'm on the ground. I don't know which reality I land on. And I feel the mother come in. I know in every part of my body nothing will ever be the same. And very quickly it begins to happen. So I can no longer work with people because I'm so shocked and fragmented. And by miracle, okay.
Yeah.
You know,
How many people were in the car with you?
Me and a friend who
Was she
also
also
is
okay?
by miracle okay. Not the person who hit us, you know, broken. But I mean, so very quickly I can no longer work with people. I am shaken up. My life is shaken up. My field is shaken up. My body is dislocated.
In what way were you working with people at this time?
I had a healing. I was working with.
You were a healer
healing
already
work.
at that time.
Yes, I already graduated from the Barbara Brennan School. I had a healing practice. I was working with people in the healing way.
How many years ago was this?
In 2012, in October 2012.
So not long ago, really.
No. And so what began to happen was that it was like reality began to strip me. So immediately I could no longer work with people. It was clear.
Yeah.
There was such a shattering that happened in me that all of my old ideas about myself, all of my old ideas about life and God and healing just began to be stripped from me. Very quickly, my father died. So there was already this sense of like everything was already shattered and shaken and stripped, and then my father died, and that was a whole other level, right? I didn't have time. It was months, like a few months afterwards. My ego, my personality didn't have time to reorganize.
Yeah.
And the next shattering, you know, foundation, trembling, and really within a week, my life in France ended. It was like, and I found myself with my family moving back to Florida to take care of my mother, who was shattered. And, you know, it's still in this trembling place, one more layer stripped. And just as I was beginning to reorganize, my marriage ended, devastated at the feet of reality, nothing left. No bone left on the other, you know, just naked. You know, when you have no skin, when nothing holds you anymore. So never a time to reorganize, and yet and again. So what's really interesting is that burned up again. And it felt like there was nothing left of me. And you know, interestingly, actually, in that process, I was just experiencing all the things that they say are the most traumatizing in life, like death, divorce, and moving, you know, supposed to be. And for me, you know, that the divorce was the most shattering. Like it really took away, like the mother had to take it all out of my cold, dead hands, you know. And it's really after that that I see that process of the dark night of the soul begin to unfold. Because the dark night of the soul isn't a depression, it's not a difficulty in your life. It's something entirely other. It's a kind of, the mystic John of the Cross, Saint John of the Cross, who coined the term, the dark night of the soul, spoke of it as this period of time of radical spiritual crisis.
Yeah.
Where you go into the dark, where God disappears, your relationship with God is kind of gone. You're abandoned in the great darkness, and all of your ideas don't work anymore. And so that began to really happen to me. And shattered and broken and fragmented, what it felt like was happening was that I began to, through the darkness, through leaning into that dislocation and brokenness and uncertainty, like there was nothing that I could hold on to anymore. Something began to emerge. And for me, what it was, the way I experienced it, was a relationship with the mother, where there was nothing else to hold on to. And it was almost like I was being rewoven, and my relationship with reality, as it was before, it was a relationship with ideas and concepts and really smart things and you know, spiritual know-how and beautiful experiences, you know, and lots of love and light, actually. And when all of that got stripped from me, something other began to emerge, and I think it's like a direct experience with reality. And so, in a way, my movement began being from, I am doing my spiritual work to get better because I'm suffering so much and I want to improve myself. And I want to purify myself to be this more illuminated, greater, more pure being, into like, Mother, take me. Like, laying it all at her feet, having, you know, no longer knowing what it is that I need. Like being deeply and intimately at the feet of reality. And rather than that movement of improvement, it became a movement towards the unknown. You know, towards, I became less powerful, more vulnerable, less certain, not more. And it still kind of feels for me like I was just telling you, right, before when I was like, my head was cut off. And it's like everything just slowly unfolds for me. I don't know what the next moment brings. From a very bright, I think, rather intelligent person, I became a much less coherent kind of, you know. It's just, I guess, part of the process.
Yeah.
And
So,
I'm deepening into that.
Yeah.
This emergent process for me. So
Wow.
don't listen.
No, listen. Wow. So Vera, this is so beautiful, and you know, thank you for being so vulnerable and talking about this in such a raw and open way. It's so refreshing, actually. And you know, I hear you in that tendency towards intellectualism that was very comforting, because you know, I definitely empathize with that. I feel like I'm still to a certain degree that kind of a being, and so you know, the dark night of the soul, you know, when you were mentioning it, and I've encountered this idea before, and for me, I have an experience. It's not quite as, you know, it's not quite as all-pervasive as I feel like yours has been for you. But I can remember, you know, my ideas about God when I was quite young, and it was a conversation I was having with a woman who I knew and I respected, and she was sort of a mentor. She was several years older than me. I babysat her daughter, and we had a conversation, something about Egyptian something. I don't even know. I just remember it had something to do with ancient Egypt. Don't ask me why or what the connection was. But she, at the end of that conversation, and I was raised Judeo-Christian, I had a very deep faith. You know, I was one of those kids that like went out and like was like, Jesus knows how many hairs you have on your head. And when people wouldn't believe me, like I remember my neighbor kids were like, that's not possible. Jesus can't know how many hairs. And I would go home to my mom and be like, they're going to hell because they don't believe.
Yeah, I understand. Like that kind of initial, really fundamentalist. Really
but,
black and white. Right?
Exactly, but also world shaping. You know, that was the shape of my world, and I lost that. You know, and I remember staring up at an image that I had in my room of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, which actually earlier when I was thinking about this, because I wanted to talk to you about this, you know, I feel like there's more to unpack about that I never have even thought about until recently, because that moment in the Garden of Gethsemane for Jesus is like a moment of a profound, you know, like despair and praying for hope and getting through something like this dark night. So it's very symbolic, but you know, but just to kind of, and so for me, you know, I had that experience in a maybe a less extreme way of feeling totally totally without any buoy to cling to. You know, all of my conceptions about God were obliterated, and I couldn't go back. You know, I couldn't go back to that belief, even though I wanted to. Like, I remember sitting there and really wanting and actually praying to give me my faith back, you know? And so, you know, and now, of course, through my own studies and practice, I've encountered a new conception of divinity that's much more expansive and not so easily broken. And so I feel like that's what, you know, and I think it's, you know, to get kind of segue now into kind of this, the dark feminine and the dark night of the soul, and we've talked a little bit about it, but I feel like, you know, in order for divinity not to be broken, we have to be able to embrace that knowledge or understanding of it, because, you know, how many times do we hear things like, how could a God exist that would do this to the world? Or how could a God exist who would allow this to happen? And it's because I feel like part of what you're saying is this idea that that God can't contain within itself the kind of destruction that we see, and sort of moving in the direction of an understanding of the divine darkness, or the dark feminine, or however you want to put it, is am I right to say that it's a tarrying or an engagement with that?
So let's hold the thought about God and containment, because it's really important. So my first thought is that Paul Tillich, who is a really beloved Christian theologian, used to say, the opposite of faith is not doubt. The opposite of faith is certainty.
Mm-hmm.
And in my understanding, what the dark night does is matures us.
Mm-hmm.
It is the process of spiritual maturation. And it is necessarily about throwing us into the pit of uncertainty.
Yeah.
The old, young, immature, fundamentalist, dualistic faith has to die, has to crumble.
Mm-hmm.
Because without that, you can never mature. I mean, what strikes me is the necessity and the universal importance of initiation, which has been lost in our culture. But originally, and still today in indigenous cultures, and in order for the person to be considered a mature adult member of their tribe, there is a version of being taken and thrown into a dark pit. Usually in the middle of the night, usually when you don't know what's really happening to you. Sometimes you do, but versions of that where you are taken out of your context, taken out of your certainties, and thrust into some kind of experience from which you do not know that you will recover. You do not know that you will survive it. And it is through wrestling with that, through being thrown into that darkness, through having to learn to see in the dark, right? The pupils to dilate, your system to begin to experience what you're made of, really. Not your story about yourself, not your story about God, not your story about the world, but something more that you, if you survive, then can begin to take your place in the orders of life and the orders of your community as a mature human being. And so that is somewhat the function of the dark night of the soul. It is an initiatory process, which initiates us into the truth of who we are, into the real spiritual life, which looks nothing like what we're told. It's not making 25 affirmations 7 times a day or tapping yourself out of your suffering, right? It's about largely engaging with pain, engaging with what's really present, not suppressing it, not trying to wipe it away, not trying to, but in growing in our tolerance for what's real, right? And there's so many. We're tired collectively of the improvement projects. We are tired of the bullshit of The Secret or the Law of Attraction or the positive thinking.
Yes.
It is done. It is done. What's emerging now, we're so starved for the real. We will do anything. We will meet anything. We yearn for the real, and I feel that collectively. I feel it in politics, in our popular culture. I feel it emerging in the spiritual marketplace, which 10 years ago was talking about The Secret, and now it's talking about Brene Brown and vulnerability. And so I have a lot of hope, and I feel like that's what's happening. And the fact that we're somewhat collectively entering the dark night of the soul, politically, certainly, yeah. And this is all part of the emergent initiation that is necessary for us to grow the up as a culture. Excuse my French. Yeah.
You can speak French on this podcast.
Oh, good. Right? To grow up and to allow something wholly other than what we have seen before to emerge. And unfortunately, it emerges from some very devastating, uncomfortable places.
Yeah.
Which stretch us and must, so that we can begin to not just think. And be bright and shiny, and save ourselves, spend our life saving ourselves from reality, saving ourselves from our uncomfortable feelings, from the anxiety that's here, from whatever is here, but rather leaning into what's here, right? Leaning into what's present, whatever it is, and allowing real wisdom, which emerges from the dark, to become embodied in us. First, she breaks us. So the myth of Kali, and feel free to interrupt.
Oh no, I'm loving it. Keep talking.
In the myth of Kali, demons, great demons are taking over the world, and there are various versions of this myth, but great demons are taking over the world, and they're the demons of greed and ego and separation. And the reason they're taking over the world is because in their love for praise and the gods, the demons are very good at doing practices, spiritual practices, and they receive the gifts from the gods of invulnerability. They ask to be impenetrable. Well, that's maybe not the word. They ask to not be able to be killed by any man or god. Of course, first of all, they underestimate the feminine here, right? And secondly, so the goddess Durga comes. She's the great warrior goddess, right? She's given all these weapons of war by all the gods, and she comes riding her pussy, riding her tiger or her lion, usually in her iconography, on the battlefield, and she's a ferocious warrioress. You know, she conquers it all, but this particular demon or demons, it depends on the myth on the particular Kali myth. With every drop of blood, 1,000 more demons arise.
Yeah.
So Durga is beginning to see that the battle for the world is about to be lost. So suddenly from within Durga, a more ferocious, deeper, more darker aspect of the dark feminine emerges, right? And that's Kali. She comes up from her third eye. And Kali is hungry and dark and angry and bloody, and she has this tongue, right? And she begins to lick up the blood of the demons, right? Before it hits the ground, and she conquers. She conquers the demons. She saves the world, right? The dark feminine comes in and saves the world. I mean, so many things to say about it. One is that the feminine has been oppressed, suppressed, violated, mutilated for thousands of years, and it's time for it to emerge. How else would she emerge? Right? How else would she emerge but angry and fierce and dark and dirty, right? Like everything that has been done to the feminine in the masculine and in the feminine. Because we're not one or the other. It's not about men or women.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to say. But then the other thing to say is that it's the darkness that emerges because it's the darkness that contains everything. It's the great mystery that's beyond our ideas. She comes and she cuts off the head. so that the heart can emerge, so that we can begin to live, to breathe, to function, to live from the heart. And in that myth, there is a second part, which sometimes isn't talked about, but she conquers the world. Everyone goes, woohoo! But she begins to dance, a wild dance. She begins to dance, and as she dances, she's the goddess of destruction. The world begins to tremble, the world begins to shake, and all the gods get fucking scared because she is dancing, the feminine is dancing, and she's out of control, there's no controlling her. We get very scared when something isn't controlling the feminine, right? And traditionally what the myth says is that the gods sent Shiva, her husband, to stop her. They say, we don't know what to do. She's about to destroy the world. Go save us, help the world. So first she saves the world, but now it seems to everyone that she's about to destroy the world. And the gods are like terrifying. Oh my God, that crazy woman is going to destroy the world now. And so the myth goes, Shiva has to go and contain his wife, control his wife, so he lays down under her feet and cries out, and one of the myths, Ma, Ma. And so she remembers that she's the mother of the world, and she calms down because of her husband, and everything is reestablished, the balance is reestablished. And that's beautiful. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But I'd like to reclaim that myth, the possibility of her knowing that the old world needs to shatter, that her wild dance shakes up, shatters the old world, and that's necessary. She knows when to stop, but she also knows that nothing of the old can remain. Nothing of the world in which the old demons could take over can remain. She needed to shake up that world, and she needs to shake up our world. Nothing of the old self can remain. And so I really welcome us to sort of conceive of that possibility and the importance of that dance.
Yeah.
And when that dance begins to unfold in our lives, not to think of it as abomination, not to think of it as something that we need to resist and stop because, our lives were perfect and we were so smart and we had so much success. All these false paradigms of success have to shatter. We live in a world that's koyo naskatsi, right? Totally out of balance. The old stories have come to the end, and it's good. They have to shatter. We have to go into that dark night. We have to not know if we can survive. Maybe as we dance that dance, something new can emerge. And so that's really
that is so beautiful.
Invitation.
What a beautiful, beautiful story, and the myth, and the way you kind of move back and forth between the symbolism and the way in which it connects. I mean, I can feel its resonance, and one thing that you remark in one of your articles about something about I'm with her, Kali.
Oh, yeah.
I'm with her.
Sure.
Yeah, and it was right after the election, and you had basically written that this was this kind of election of Donald Trump was kind of a move towards this dark night of the soul. So the dark night of the soul is something that can happen individually for a person, but it can also happen culturally. Is that sort of the idea?
I mean, first of all, what do I know? But that's a little bit what I saw emerging, right? That yes, I think necessarily in every human life, we will have pain, we will have suffering, we will have times when everything falls apart. And then in our spiritual life, if we're lucky, God will throw us into the dark pit and begin to do her work on our souls in that darkness. And I think that that's a necessary spiritual initiation without which we cannot mature.
Do you think that we culturally...
And collectively, culturally too.
Yeah. Do you think that we need, culturally to reappropriate that idea of initiation? Do you think that in one sense it will happen, right? I have this initiation, you have an initiation, but we don't have there's no...
Ritual. Yeah. There's no ritual.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've disconnected from these initiatory experiences that in the past have been held in community.
Yeah.
Right? We have disconnected from even having elders, people who've walked the path before us, who can help guide us. And so now there's this, I feel like we're in a very interesting age where our religious identities are shifting and changing. Our experiences we are drawing from various lineages, various spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
What's available to us is so much vaster than has ever been available to us in any given time in history. And so how that gets woven and how we begin to reshape for ourselves those experiences, it's very interesting to see. I mean, I feel like a lot of that is beginning to reemerge in new ways in our spiritual cultures, because I feel like there's multiplicity, right? Many cultures, it's not one.
Yeah.
And where it doesn't exist, which is like in our in the general world, life seems to be doing it for us. Yeah. Yes, it doesn't exist. There isn't something to hold us or even give us a narrative that this is something that's essential, that this is something that's healthy, that this is something that's part of the human experience. And the mystical lineages all speak about it in the non-dual Advaita Vedanta traditions. That's the death before you die, right? Like that we see over and over again. That place of ego death.
Yeah.
So it's talked about in all the traditions, not in the fundamentalist level where most people engage with those traditions, but somewhere. And so what is hopeful for me is that you hear this discourse re-emerge. I mean, people like Andrew Harvey speak so much about the emergence, right? And Mirabai Starr, who translated the St. John of the Cross. There's so many people in the spiritual culture who are speaking about it, and I feel like we're finally listening. We're finally listening, and yes, we need that. The fact that we live in a place where that's not being held by anything is problematic.
Yeah.
And we're finding new ways, or at least I see new ways emerging, which are holding us.
Yeah.
In new religious movements, at least in new ways in which we're weaving, even in yoga community.
Yeah.
It's being spoken about more,
I think we're getting wiser, we're getting wiser as a community.
We're
and
maturing
I think
a little
we
bit.
are. And I think that as a community, if I can speak of like a wider wisdom community, as I sometimes reference, I don't know to what extent that exists. I think there are, many different communities that fall under this wisdom umbrella, but I do think that the access to more insightful, more insightful understandings of the tradition and the lineage streams is happening more and more, and people have a more nuanced understanding, and we're seeing more concrete, more rigorous explorations and understanding of things rather than the kind of fluffy, just put a gemstone on your third chakra type
There's
of thing.
nothing wrong with putting a gemstone on your third chakra, and something needs to start our path. Something needs to touch our heart. Something needs, we all come to the spiritual life because we're suffering and we want to get better. I mean, and for a certain period of time, that movement is a necessary movement.
Yeah.
Right? Because we need healing. Because we need, we need, something has to pull us in. But knowing that that's not going to be the only part of the path, that at some point that model of self-improvement has to collapse on itself.
Yeah.
Right? That we have to stop.
Can you talk a little bit more? So the self-improvement paradigm, let's call it. Can you describe, because we've referenced it a little bit, we haven't really defined it, and I think that's a really interesting point, an important point. So the difference between the self-improvement projects versus what we're talking about, which is like a confronting and becoming intimate with, pain, trauma, and all of that, dark stuff. So what is the self-improvement? Can you give
Sure. First of all, there's nothing wrong with it's not either or.
Yeah,
so that's the first place to say that there are so many levels on which we do spiritual work.
Right.
We work with the body, we work with our emotions, we work with our trauma. We work on understanding things in our intellectual life, and then there's these kind of levels of consciousness, an entire spectrum.
Yeah.
Right. So it seems to me, and if I read the traditions correctly, is that what pulls us in is our need to get better.
Yeah.
And in that need, especially in our what we call spiritually materialistic culture,
Yeah.
right? You have a lot of tools to improve yourself, and they're wholly beautiful, powerful tools, right? It can be anything from gemstone on your third chakra to doing affirmations,
Yeah.
to reading, let's say, and I'm sorry to dog the secret, reading like about the law of attraction and realizing you're not confined to your circumstances. It can be like so many different tools, or tapping yourself, because that does something, right?
Yeah.
Going to healers. As a healer, I say this not in a pejorative way, but there is a time where, like, for a long period of time, where like, I am not well, I'm going to fix my not wellness. And the healing path begins to unfold. At some point, that healing path will take you to a place where you realize that you cannot save yourself from reality. You realize that you cannot save yourself from suffering. You realize that, as someone put it, and I wish I could remember who, that you find yourself at a crossroads. And you realize that the path to the right leads to hell, and the path to the left leads to hell. And where you came from was utter and absolute fucking hell, and that in front of you
Is hell.
is hell. And when you come to that crossroads, you give up. You give up the self-improvement project. You don't stop healing. But you give up the immature idea that if I just do a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that, I'll become awake, I'll become pure enough, I'll become, worthy enough. All of that, you stop having that misconception. One of my teachers, Jason Schulman, says, you become weary and tired. When you become weary and tired from that perpetual, I have to improve, I have to resolve, and you have to resolve. It's not to say that you don't. You have to keep working on that place where you go to therapy and you go to healers and you try to improve it. But at some point, you realize that comes to an end, and you surrender. Right? To me, what my language is like, you lay it all down at the mother's feet. You realize it's not in your hands anymore. That movement, like, okay, I'm yours, mother. Take me, right? Do with me what you will. And that's a bit of a different relationship with reality. It's no longer one of control.
Yeah.
You realize you're powerless.
Right.
And in that, something happens to your heart. In that, something happens to your relationship with yourself, with others, with God. Yeah.
So there's a profound surrender. Yeah. That self-improvement projects, in the idea that I can fix myself, there's still this kind of agency.
And violence.
Yeah.
Somewhat,
Right.
What happens if you don't fix yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is a part of this that you're talking about also aligned with an understanding of awakening or enlightenment that is different from how it's generally packaged?
Such a good question. I don't know very much about enlightenment or awakening. I mean, I am like a hot mess of brokenness and yearning and longing and chaos. So I'm the wrong person to ask about that.
Yeah.
Even though I tend towards, ecstatic states, and ecstasy and agony for me are so close. So close that, sometimes you can't tell the difference. So I don't know about enlightenment, but I can tell you that all the spiritual traditions that we know of on the planet almost exclusively have been made by usually celibate men, for usually celibate men. And the model is that this world is somehow impure. This body is somehow impure. And we have to improve it, purify it, and we have to abandon this horribly painful, impure world and go up the mountaintop, up into the blissful, ecstatic worlds of love and light, where none of this inconvenient, stuff exists. And so it's been a little bit lineages of, awakened men taking other men to awaken up in the mountain. And the feminine movement is very different. The feminine movement is like down into this world where there's so much pain, where there's so much mud, right? Like, it's interesting, the lotus grows out of the mud, but that feminine movement is down into what's here. And Shakti doesn't differentiate whether it's anger or sadness or fear or bliss, right? It's just life force. And how you stop yourself from experiencing what's here. Let's say it's fear. We're taught that love is the opposite of fear. Fear is bad. We shouldn't feel it. We should, what do? We cover it up. We stuff it inside. We disconnect. We disown, right? And the mother has no orphans. She takes in. She says, this is my child too. And she uses it all and takes it back into the body and says, tremble for your fear. Use it. This is you. This is your life force. This is your being. Don't disown. Don't cut off. Don't split off. Stay, feel it. Let it awaken your heart. Let it break you open. So that movement is down and into the body and into this life. And so what happens then, hopefully, is that those tendencies that we've seen historically and just generally, because it's so much lovelier to go up and away, right? And the tendency downwards, because then we have like the Sri Yantra, then we have the union, right? The true spiritual marriage between the feminine and the masculine, those paths, upward tending paths and downward tending path, and we can arrive here in this moment and be with all of it, with the entire range of reality. We don't have to disown anything anymore. We don't have to disconnect. We don't have to keep running. We can stay here. We can stay here. We can hold it all, and there's so much to hold. Our world is in so much suffering. If we don't have the privilege of going up a mountain anymore. Our world is in crisis, and the world, we are all that there is, and like Kali, the mother has to come in and in the rise for her children, right? We have to bring that aspect in now. We have to become the mother, you as much as me, to respond to what's here. Enough of the dissociative kind of paths.
Wow, how beautifully said. So, you're talking a lot about, there's a lot of things, and one beautiful thing that I really like about so many things that you're saying is that there's very much like an intersectional, and this is something we talked about before we started recording, there's like an intersectional spirituality that you represent. Like you draw on, you've drawn on things that sort of feel like Buddhist ideas, and of course Buddhism has been very formative for you. And then you're drawing on like, Hindu deity mythology and symbolism. And so, are you, is it kind of, I'd love to hear, and I know, and this might branch or segue into a conversation about this workshop or retreat that you were just in, where it was sort of the future of religion, and there were many people there who represented different lineage streams and traditions, and so. Do you really see the kind of, first of all, what is the future of religion from your perspective, and is it sort of this? How do they fit together in your experience? Because for the crude, I guess a more crude understanding would think, well, this one has this sort of recipe and this one has that, and this seems to be a very different kind of God than this one.
In the sense in which, like, Hinduism will work, let's say, with yoga and many gods, and that's one path totally separate from, let's say, Christianity, and it's, let's say, I don't know, monastic.
One's a judgmental guy in the sky, another one is,
So first of all, really good question. At some point, I want to locate myself. So if I get derailed, just bring me back so I can tell you about my path. But to understand that this is what religion looks like. Every religious tradition, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Islam, starts on the bottom, because let's talk about consciousness mapping, right? So if we look at consciousness as a spectrum, here, Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and will have a fundamentalist aspect, right? At the very bottom, it's all very split and dualistic.
Yeah.
My God, your God, good, bad, fundamentalist interpretation of scripture, it's all on the bottom. At the bottom, they look all very, very different and the consciousness is very split, very dualistic. It's all in duality. But as within each religion, there's an entire spectrum of religiosity and experience. And as you mature, you move up, let's say up, that spectrum. So there will be, at the very bottom in Islam, there will be like fundamentalist Muslims who are blowing shit up because you're not Muslim and I am. At the very top, there will be Sufi mystics who will speak, Rumians who will speak about the union of God. And at the bottom, they all look very, very different. And as they move up, and the experience of God matures and splits you open, in the end, all the mystics speak the same language. It doesn't look so split. It's really the unitive experience, the non-dual experience that they all share. So just say it's not one religion versus the other. It's where in that spectrum do you locate yourself? And yes, different religions have maybe different medicines, right? But the process of human spiritual development is much, much more similar than we can imagine. So for me, I'm maybe interspirituality is a great term, and I'll talk to you about this retreat that I did just now. But so interspirituality, I grew up in a communist world. I grew up in the former Soviet Union, and
was religion allowed in Ukraine?
No, that's the kick. Yeah. The kick was that there was no God, there was no religion. It was a very a secular society. There was no God, no religion. It wasn't really even allowed so much, right? God was dead. But from a very, very, very young age, and I grew up in Jewish secular. For my parents, God was poetry and kindness and literature and human suffering and human beauty, and it wasn't contextualized in religion and protest, and it wasn't contextualized in a religious structure. But I remember, I don't know age-wise, I wish I could tell, but 4 or 5 years old, hearing the word God, and it was so formative for me. I dropped into I remember it was oh, that's my home, right? God. And I remember every time I would hear the word God, it was mine. That was mine. My name in Russian means faith, so there might have been a little bit of linguistic, oh, faith, God, all right. But I remember dropping into it and always searching for it. It was my own. It belonged to me. That was mine. And when I was 10 years old, I lived in a city that before World War II was Polish. And I went to a Polish school where my parents put me because they didn't need to have, for some reason they were exempt from communist ideology. The conversation was that they didn't have to, they had their own system. It's probably from old Poland, I don't know. But what they also had was sort of in secret, they had nuns and priests come in and teach religion because Polish people are such strong Catholics. Yeah. And oh my God. I mean, I was they're talking about it. They're my people. Now I was Jewish. It was complex, but Judaism in my culture was a nationality. I don't want to go into that. But the point being, I went in secret when I was 10 years old and had my first communion in the Catholic Church, in secret from my parents. And I came home and I was I had my first communion, and they were oy vey, what's, Gewalt. And then I was I guess it is very unkosher. So I went, then they had these mass, this was just as the country was breaking up, and religion was emerging all over the world. So all these different sects and cults and religions were beginning to come out. So I went to Armenian Orthodox Church, and I went to a mass baptism because like my sort of grandfather, great-grandfather, and my mother said it was like Armenian. So I was like, God here and God there. And there were like Baptists in stadiums healing people. And I was like sneaking away and like, I mean, this is like 10, 11 years old, right? Like telling my mom I'm going to sleep over at my friend's house and then like going and like doing the healings with the Baptists and like the falling backwards in stadiums kind of thing. I needed God. Like it was home. It was mine. And it didn't matter what religion. It was like any home was my home. And then I came to America. I immigrated. Judaism was also a religion. I didn't know. It was just something I was hiding and stamped in my passport as a nationality. And I was like, oh my God, this is God too. So I started studying Judaism. And by the time I was 13 and now in the States, I read every New Age book in the library. Right? Like I had one pointed, like I had no interest in anything else ever in my life almost, I could say, except for God and spirituality. And so I don't know why that was for me. It's just like, what I was kind of made of. And then I went to college and grad school, and it all kind of remained in the same, trajectory, which not so varied, but that was a little bit my path. And so interspirituality, and that I did Buddhist practice, and I was shaped by so many streams of consciousness, right? And someone who really influenced me was Ken Wilber, for example.
I'm interviewing him in a few weeks. Yeah.
Well, lucky you, and so I think that's such a good place for those of us who, are on a spiritual path.
Yeah.
To the way he maps consciousness, and we begin to understand things a little bit differently. It's no longer this thing, one religion versus the other.
Mm-hmm.
It begins to be something else. And so this retreat that I was in, it was called The Future of Religions. It's like an interspiritual fellowship created by Rory McEntee and Adam Bucko and who are doing the new monastic movement, and Nathaniel Eves Yepes, who bring together interspiritual leaders for this interspiritual dialogue. And in the past, interspiritual dialogues looked a lot like a person grounded in like Catholicism with a person grounded in Buddhism with a person grounded in Islam, maybe in a Sufi tradition, and they all come together from their locations within their religious traditions, and they're pretty normative experience, not dogmatic necessarily, but normative, like this is what you do in my tradition.
Yeah.
And then they talk together from the location of their spiritual tradition.
Yeah.
Well, that's changing a lot, it seems. Many of us, if not most of us, are now shaped by multiple religious and spiritual lineages, by multiple traditions. Let's say if I'm an Episcopal priest, I might also have a really deep connection in my heart with the Sufi lineage that informed me, that shaped me, that like had its way with my heart, and yet I'm an Episcopal priest. And so how do you live with that kind of intersectionality, that multiple belonging, right? And what we see is that many of us who are emergent on the scene are no longer shaped by a single lineage, by a single tradition. How do we live with that? How do we make sure that our spirituality isn't superficial, that we're not eating a little bit of ice cream from here, a little bit of ice cream from there, and never really growing up? Right. So it was a really rich and beautiful dialogue. And so what seems to be emerging is new ways of being interspiritual, and that it doesn't have to be superficial, that it's deep and grounded and emergent from our souls, and that it's happening not just in you and me, but collectively, that something on the planet is like weaving it, that it's needed. It's needed, and that we're being held somehow by these streams of wisdom that are being rewoven and emerging in new ways. Yeah.
Wow. That's really beautiful. I wish I had been at that retreat. Yeah. So, one thing, you kind of mentioned this with the ice cream analogy, and because some people will describe the kind of salad bar spirituality. Yeah, exactly. So I want to kind of distinguish what you're talking about from this idea. And, oftentimes the criticism of like salad bar spirituality is that, you dig a lot of holes and you're never going to reach China because you're just digging a bunch of small holes. So in the example of practice, for example, when, someone of a particular lineage might say, you need, many years of consistent practice in order to bear the fruits of that particular spiritual technology. But if you're kind of allowing yourself to move around to these various streams and however you move do you ever stay with one kind of practice long enough to bear that kind of fruit?
That's such a good question. I mean, I don't know if it's a personal question, but I think that it's a question we all need to really consider in our spiritual lives, right? Are we going from retreat to retreat, or do we have a practice at all? Yeah. What is deepening, right? What is doing its work on us? Because that's kind of why we do spiritual practice, right? Yeah. And it almost, I mean, there's so many different kinds of practices. Yeah. They all do something. So there's, I mean, because this goes into do we need a teacher? Yeah. Right? What does a teacher need to be a good teacher? Yeah. Who is a good teacher? There's the good, the bad, and the ugly, as you know, all over the place, right? So maybe one of the ways of looking at it is that we build discernment. It's not something that arises all in one day. That maybe maybe our soul, we need to listen. Mm-hmm. We need to learn to listen, to trust what's emerging for us, what's there in our heart, that there is some kind of a guidance that that moves us through the salad bar until something deeper calls us, you know? I like that way. That it's not maybe necessarily like a critique of the salad bar, but that, well, I needed to taste this and that, and then slowly the discernment emerges. Yeah. And slowly, if we're lucky, a good, integrated, mature teacher, we find. And maybe then we can have, and what is a teacher? And maybe it's not a teacher, maybe it's a mentor. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a spiritual friend, but someone who's just a little bit, who's walked the territory. Mm-hmm. So that we don't have to rediscover, can you imagine, rediscover thousands of years of spiritual technology, so to speak, but that we listen, this is so lovely, right? That we listen deeply enough to see what is calling us at this particular moment. Mm. And that we are, we have so many resources available to us. Yeah. That we give ourselves permission to follow guidance, and yet not to go tripping. I had this spiritual, because we are a little bit like light junkies, I call it, right? We go tripping on spiritual buzzes, God. And so let's talk about spiritual bypassing. I'm sure all of your guests do. So it's like now, the fact that we're even speaking about that collectively is so huge. We weren't 5 years, 10 years ago, right? So we don't feel so comfortable with all this human crap and all the pain and suffering that happens in relationship. Let's bypass it. Let's go into bliss and love and whatever. Maybe not so much. Yeah. So bring me back. I feel like I lost my train of thought.
You're saying how this is, and you're remarking on how this talk of spiritual bypassing is indicative of a kind of maturity that's happening in the spiritual community, and I really like what you say about needing to kind of go through the salad bar, and I think that's a very diplomatic kind of, it's a good understanding of it, because I actually feel like in certain ways I did that myself, and I have, it was I guess 12 years of yoga practice. Well, I mean, I practiced yoga like maybe 6 years before I started taking the spirituality of it seriously. Because I went through this this loss of my Christian beliefs, and then for a long time I couldn't even stomach anyone talking about God. I literally couldn't. I didn't want to. I went into my first yoga classes where they would talk about God. I was just like, every cell in my body was rolling its eyes, and that took a long time to have new ears for that. And then you go through, and I for a long time I was like, I don't need a teacher, blah blah blah. And then this this particular teacher that I have now, it was like, when I first heard him speak, I was like, oh, he's speaking my language. He's speaking my language, and I'm like, he has something that I desire. Yeah, that I yearn for.
The deep calling to the deep, right? Like something in you knows and has the discernment now to know that something he has, some kind of medicine, is what your soul needs. Yeah. Right? Like, that's how we establish our authority too, like our real authority, not like, Yeah. I mean, what you're saying actually reminds me of last year, I speak at the Science and Non-Duality Conference.
Which is great.
Right?
I think we're going this year. But Rebecca and I, my colleague who you met, yeah.
But
are you speaking at it this year too?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah,
we'll
I'm going to. Yeah, please. So last year, I think, well, maybe it's the year before, last year, Richard Rohr. I don't know if you know who Richard Rohr is, but everyone should. If there's only one spiritual book that you read,
Okay.
it's not the Bible. It's, my God, it escapes me now. But it's by Richard Rohr. It's like, what is it called? Oh my
Weaving.
God! 2/3 of life. The falling upwards.
Falling Upwards by Richard
Rohr. He's a Christian theologian, and it's just like really, really, really. It's located very much in the Christian context, but it is so rich. But so Father Richard Rohr, he's from the Christian tradition. You know, we don't typically think of Christianity as particularly non-dual, right?
Yeah.
We retain that title mostly for the Vedic path, maybe some Buddhism, maybe some Hinduism, right?
Yeah.
But it is a great example of how then Christianity is also a non-dual path. And so Richard Rohr spoke from that location within Christianity.
That's beautiful.
And it was actually quite beautiful and touching because people were crying in the audience. And then afterwards, he had this kind of like a question and answer session. And like, I don't know, hundreds of people went to that. And they were all people who've been wounded by that experience of not being able to find their hearts and their original, right? Like who've been brokenhearted, like it sounds like you have, you know? Kind of all twisted up by that kind of dissociative, early, immature religiosity.
Yeah.
I mean, people came and bared their souls, and it was so healing for so many people to see that there's something like that in my tradition too.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing. No, thank you for saying that, because I don't think I've ever heard anyone speak of the non-dual path in Christianity.
Oh,
and
it's so profound, and all the mystical writings, and it's pervasive throughout Christianity.
Yeah.
It's just that most of the time, certainly on the collective level, that's not how we engage with Christianity.
Yeah, yeah. Is a lot of that come from like the Christian mystics, like Saint Teresa of Avila and stuff like that?
Saint Teresa of Avila.
Avila.
I mean, St. John of the Cross. I keep referencing the
yeah.
same stuff, but it doesn't even matter. We don't have to go, you know, and St. Julian of Norwich. There's so much of it.
Yeah.
Meister Eckhart.
Yeah.
You know, really so much of it. It's just that for some reason, I mean, now more and more it's rediscovered and people are reclaiming it.
Yeah.
So just to, again, come back to the point, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
It's just,
yeah.
God pervades.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And may
Beautiful.
we all be lucky enough, have like the good fortune, be blessed enough to find it, to be guided, right? To where we're wanted,
Yeah.
to find that resonance in our hearts and in our souls. And I believe that's how reality functions. There's this operative, like, quality of life that does that to us, that weaves us, that once, you know, it has some kind of a relationship to surrender. That if we listen deeply enough, if we can lean into that, if we can surrender to that, something begins to carry us, to guide us to that next step. And it's like the path will rise to meet your walking. You're taking a step into the abyss every time, and something rises to catch you and guide you to that next step.
Wow. Beautiful. That's such a nice note to end on. So, wow, Vera, this has been really beautiful. And, you know, some of you are out there watching on this Facebook Live that we've turned on, but, you know, for those who can't see us, who are listening to the podcast, you know, Vera is, you know, as you can tell, she speaks with so much heart, but if you could see her, the tears that are in her eyes, you know, at so many points, it's like, it's profound to be in the company of someone who's so much speaking from their heart. And so I thank you so much for inhabiting that vulnerable position and sharing it, because it's inspiring for people, I think. And I think this episode is going to be very inspiring. So, Vera, you know, for others that undoubtedly want to learn more about you, how can they do that? How can they find you?
Sure. So my website is healingawakening.com. They can find my article, which I think is somehow what probably brought me here. Exactly. It's called Kali Takes America.
Kali Takes America. I'm with her.
And it's the article that kind of went strangely viral, and I think is more significant than anything about me. Somehow it seems to have be resonating in the culture. And,
beautifully resonated.
And that's.
I think one thing that I love that I didn't mention before, but is that it allows us to see the divinity in what we're experiencing politically.
Crisis,
and I think people need to see how the darkness is divine, and I mean, and that's, to me, that's really how it resonated. And then there's a second article, actually, an earlier article that I read today too, and that one's really beautiful as well. And I think, but you can find that if you read Kali Takes America, there will be a link to the previous one. She references it I think in the beginning of the article, first couple of paragraphs. So healingawakening.com. Great. And you're going to be at the Science and Non-Duality Conference.
I'm going to be at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in October. Which is a really, if you haven't heard about this conference, it brings together spiritual teachers from various traditions, mystics and visionaries and artists and scientists, and they all, share this, the sit with and work with and speak about the great questions of our time, and have this beautiful discourse that emerges from that collective kind of coming together. It's very interesting.
It's beautiful. I really feel really blessed to have found it. In fact, a lot of the speakers list I've sort of reached out to. That was one of the ways I found you. Yeah.
And it's happening in October in San Jose, California.
Yes. Yeah, San Jose. So come and hang out with Vera and me and Rebecca. We'll be in there in October. All right. Thank you so much, Vera. It's been such a pleasure.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah. Speak to you soon.
Okay. Bye.